Okay, so today we are continuing and finishing up our discussion of muscle fibers. So last time we talked primarily about how we can have fast and slow fibers depending on how fast we break down ATP with the ATPase on the myosin. So those are two of the ways we're going to define our muscle fibers. The next topic we're going to talk about are breaking down our muscle fibers based on whether they are glycolytic or oxidative. So this is part of why we were talking about metabolism again and the different ways that our cells can get energy. So I want you to take a look at this question on the board and write down or whisper to a neighbor your prediction about why it is that a glycolytic fiber, so one adapted for glycolysis, is going to fatigue more quickly than an oxidative fiber. All right, does anybody want to share their best guess? I'm sharing me today. All right, well, we'll talk more about our glycolytic and oxidative fibers. All right, so what I was previewing for you, right? So our glycolytic fibers, one of the end results of the ways in which they're different from oxidative fibers is going to be that they're quick to fatigue. So they get tired more quickly. But in terms of their defining characteristic, right, they're defined by the type of metabolism that they do, right? So glycolysis was that first part of our breakdown of glucose, that first part of our cellular respiration, right? But glycolysis can run anaerobically. So it's out in the cytoplasm. We don't need oxygen. We can produce energy in the form of ATP from breaking those bonds in glucose. But we only get about 2 ATP on net here with glycolysis. So this is less effective for energy production, essentially, which is how we end up with that quick fatigue property, really. So that we're not able to sustain this glycolysis in terms of like how much energy we're producing over like a long period of time in the way that we'll see oxidative fibers kind of can. Okay. So the other characteristics of glycolytic fibers are also linked to that fact that they do glycolysis specifically. Okay. So glycolysis is happening out in the cytoplasm, unlike the rest of our aerobic respiration, where we had all that electron transport chain oxidative phosphorylation stuff happening in the mitochondria. So because glycolytic fibers are adapted to do glycolysis specifically, they really don't have many mitochondria because this is not important to the way that they are producing energy. So if you're looking at a glycolytic muscle fiber, it's not going to have all that many mitochondria. What it is going to have is tons of glycolytic enzymes. So metabolism is regulated by enzymes. We didn't learn all their names and exactly what step they're doing because we didn't break down metabolism into all of its nitty-gritty details. But each of the steps of all of our parts of metabolism has an enzyme or several enzymes that make that reaction happen faster, catalyze that reaction, and enable us to regulate the speed of our reactions. So we've got lots of enzymes for glycolysis specifically in our glycolytic fibers. They also have high glycogen stores. Okay. So glycogen is a storage molecule for glucose. Got a bunch of glucose monomers linked together, right? Muscles and the liver are really where we see glycogen stored. Glycogen mostly has to be used in the cells that have the glycogen because few cells have the ability to break it down and export the products of that glycogen. So our glycolytic fibers have glycogen stores in high quantities so that they're able to get that glucose pretty quickly by breaking the bonds of the glycogen that's already in that cell. And this final characteristic, the larger diameter, has to do with both the fact that they're doing glycolysis, as well as the fact that our glycolytic fibers on the whole are going to be kind of stronger in the end, or we'll see them used more in heavy exercise. So the larger diameter is great in terms of strength because it means we can have lots of our contractile proteins in that cell, in that myofibril, right? So more of our contractile proteins all set together in parallel means we can form more cross bridges and contract more strongly. So in that way, large diameter is good. But you can only have a large diameter if you don't really need anything to diffuse to the center, right? Because a large diameter means that the stuff in the middle of that cell is going to be farther from the bloodstream, from that interstitial fluid outside the cell. So glycolytic fibers can have a larger diameter because they don't have an oxygen. Oxygen is a nonpolar gas, just simple diffusion across the cell membrane. And then also it's just diffusing around our cell to get into those mitochondria. So if we have a really large diameter cell, so a really wide, thick, fat muscle fiber, if we wanted to use that oxygen in all of our mitochondria, we might have trouble getting it there quickly. But since we're only doing glycolysis, we don't need oxygen. We can increase the strength without losing that ability to do the type of metabolism we're adapted for. So our opposite type of fiber here is going to be the oxidative fiber. So the oxidative fibers are adapted for oxidative phosphorylation. So that's where we get a lot more ATP at the end of our full aerobic respiration, our breakdown of glucose. Right, so oxygen is our final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. This allows us to release a proton gradient that we've created between the matrix of the mitochondria and the intramembrane space between the inner and outer membranes. And releasing that gradient powers lots and lots of ATP production. So properties of oxidative fibers are going to be related to that metabolism type, essentially. So we're going to see that they have lots of mitochondria because they're doing oxidative phosphorylation, which happens in the mitochondria, happens across that inner membrane of the mitochondria. This one's a new one, but oxidative phosphorylation will require oxygen. It's an aerobic process. So in addition to having properties that help the oxidative fibers get oxygen from your blood efficiently, we're also going to see that they have a storage molecule for oxygen in there. So it's something called myoglobin. It's red in color and it stores oxygen inside the cell. So we basically have a little extra oxygen even before your body manages to start pumping extra blood, breathing faster, et cetera, to get more oxygen in. We've got some in the cell itself. So if you eat a turkey at Thanksgiving, right, you have white meat and dark meat. That dark meat, that's the myoglobin. That's specifically in the muscle fibers that need that oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation. So different muscle fibers are located in different parts of your body because those muscles do different things. So if you think about, right, like your legs, your hips, right, they're supporting your body weight like all the time, right? So they have to keep going and going and going. So we want to have a process where we don't fatigue all that quickly, right? Which means oxygen and this more efficient type of metabolism. So that's why we see those myoglobin stores. Right? Another way to get oxygen, right, is to just deliver oxygen through the bloodstream. So we have lots and lots of capillaries going to our oxidative fibers for extra blood flow. So oxygen is carried in the blood from the lungs to the tissue, including to our muscle tissue. Capillaries are really skinny blood vessels, little networks, and those are our sites of exchange. So when we talk about all our different parts of the vasculature, probably in like January, I think, in A&P 2, we'll talk about blood vessels. We'll talk about how we have exchange across those capillary walls, but for now, we're thinking about it as more blood flow to a muscle fiber means more oxygen, means we have oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation. Now, these oxidative fibers are going to be smaller in diameter, which means they have fewer cross bridges they can make because we got fewer of those proteins stacked together. But it means that that oxygen coming in through blood, coming and transferring across those walls of those many capillaries, can get across the whole cell pretty quickly, doesn't have that far to go, which again means that we can get oxygen to the mitochondria so we can do oxidative phosphorylation. They are more resistant to fatigue because this is a sort of longer ongoing process, gives you energy for a longer time, and it's a more efficient way to break down glucose. You get more ATP per molecule of glucose if you're doing oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. So we have fast and slow fibers based on how fast they can break ATP and do the cross-bridge cycling. We have oxidative and glycolytic fibers based on whether they're doing oxidative phosphorylation to make that ATP or glycolysis to make the ATP. If you were to look in any of the named skeletal muscles in your body, so you'd have a mix of actually 3 different types of fiber that are kind of mixing together those 2 separate types of classification. So if we say we have a slow oxidative fiber, what we're saying is it has that slow form of the myosin, and it's relying on oxidative phosphorylation in order to produce ATP. When we say we have a fast oxidative fiber, we're still doing that oxidative phosphorylation for ATP production, But now we have that fast form of the myosin, that fast ATP ACE activity. So that cross-bridge cycling is happening faster in those fast oxidative fibers. Finally, for our glycolytic fibers, we actually only have one type. All of our glycolytic fibers have that fast form of the myosin. So only one type. So slow glycolytic fibers don't exist. But this is that same pairing of myosin type and then the ATP production type, the metabolism type. So when we go, when we go through each of those three, like actual type of muscle fibers that we could categorize if we pulled one out of your muscle, we're going to see that they have the characteristics you would expect based on those two pieces to their name. So they're going to have the characteristics of being slow with the myosin, and they're going to have the characteristics associated with oxidative phosphorylation. So they have that low myosin ATP ACE activity, so kind of slower cross-bridge cycling, but they have high oxidative capacity. So they're doing aerobic metabolism, aerobic respiration. They're using oxygen. That's why they're oxidative. Okay? So they've got mitochondria, lots of them. They have a rich blood supply, so lots of capillaries, taking it from that oxidative fiber type list. Plus they have myoglobin, that oxygen storing chemical that makes them more red in color. Because they are doing oxidative phosphorylation and they have that oxygen need, and oxygen has to diffuse, they're small in diameter. So that's that second bullet point, that small diffusion barrier. And we're really thinking about oxygen and its need to diffuse. The kind of byproduct, though, is that because they're small in diameter, they can't produce as much tension. So they can't produce as much like force because they're small, they're skinny. They don't have as much actin and myosin kind of stacked together. So they're not going to produce as much force per muscle fiber. Okay. Overall, they end up fatiguing slowly, right? Because they're producing their ATP in an effective, efficient way. Also, they're only using that ATP kind of slowly because of the low myosin ATP ACE activity in this case, right? But overall, you can use them kind of for a long time. Okay. We're going to jump to the other end of the spectrum and then do our middle one last, because it's going to be kind of a mix. So we are jumping from our slow oxidative to fast glycolytic. Right, so these two are the like opposites of each other. They're really the most opposite we can have. Okay, so they're fast, so they're going to have high myosin ATP ACE activity. Right, so fast twitch. Okay, now we're adapted for glycolysis. That's the glycolytic part, right? So they're going to have high glycolytic capacity. So they have lots of glycogen stored in these fibers, so we can get that glucose real quick. We have lots of enzymes for glycolysis in these fibers, but we don't need oxygen to do glycolysis. So we're going to be lacking all those characteristics that were associated with oxidative phosphorylation, right? So they don't have myoglobin, so they don't need to store oxygen because they're not using oxygen. So this makes them white in color. Okay. They have larger diameter because they don't need oxygen to diffuse into all those mitochondria. Because they're larger in diameter, they can produce greater tension because we have just more of those contractile proteins stacked together, which means that they can produce greater tension. They're going to be stronger, but they're going to fatigue rapidly because they're not using a particularly efficient form of metabolism, and they're doing it quick, right? Because they've got this fast high myosin ATP ACE activity. So they're going to be strong, but get tired real fast. Okay. That leads us to our middle ground. Okay. So we had our fast glycolytic, which we just talked about, strong, fatiguing rapidly, high myosin activity. We had our slow oxidative. They're fatiguing really slowly. They're adapted for oxidative phosphorylation. They had that slow type of myosin ATPase activity. Now we've got fast oxidative. So this is kind of intermediate. So they have myosin that is itself kind of intermediate in activity. We're going to associate it with the fast myosin so that we can remember that this is a fast oxidative fiber. But it's a little slower than the one you would see in our fast glycolytic, potentially. They do have high oxidative capacity, right? So they're aerobic, they're using oxygen. They've got some myoglobin in here. They're slow-ish to fatigue, but they're going to fatigue a bit more rapidly than the slow oxidative fibers, which were the slowest. And in terms of how big they are, they're going to be kind of in the middle. So they're going to be intermediate in diameter. So if we are comparing all of these, if you want a table form, we've got the table form here, comparing our slow oxidative fibers, which are going to be red in color. That's why it says red. Our fast oxidative fibers, which are also red in color, versus our fast glycolytic fibers, which are white in color. So as you're studying, this is where you can find how, in like one picture, how good are they at oxidative phosphorylation? How good are they at glycolysis? How fast are they? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, when we exercise, we're going to use some mix of these fiber types. So any named muscle is a mixture of these three fiber types. And the proportion that we see these fiber types is going to depend on the function of your muscles. So postural muscles, right? So ones that have to do with posture, right? So it's just like holding yourself upright in your desk right now, right? Like that takes some support from your back muscles. But you don't want those muscles fatiguing rapidly. You don't want them tiring out, right? You want them to keep going and going and going all day. So muscles that are supporting your body position, your posture, are going to tend to have more of those slow oxidative fibers that are efficiently producing energy in the form of ATP, using it relatively slowly. Now, it happens to be the case that even though we have a mix of fiber types in any named muscle, in a motor unit, all the muscle fibers are going to be the same type. Yeah, so our motor units, remember, we have a motor neuron, right? I'll pick it here. So motor neuron, here we've got motor neuron X, and it's going to go out to multiple muscle fibers. So this is our motor unit. It's all the motor fibers innervated by one single motor neuron. Okay. So when we talked about recruitment at the end of our last unit, we saw that we had like small, middle, large motor units that were recruited in a specific order. We take the small ones first, the middle ones second, the big ones last, right? So now that we're thinking about the fiber type, right, our small motor unit had both fewer, right, fewer fibers. That was one way in which it was small. Fewer fibers. But it's also fibers that are smaller in diameter. Right? So I'm going to say small fibers. And you can kind of even see that in the image, right? They've made these fibers narrower versus we got big fat blobby ones over here for Z. Small fibers. Okay. But these facts together that we're triggering these small motor units first, right? More delicate movements first, and then more and more force. So you only expend as much energy as you need to do a task, right? Start out with only a little bit, right? So the fact that we have these small fibers, fewer fibers, and these small motor units, we can now say exactly what fiber type that's going to be, right? So a small fiber is small so that it can have oxygen diffuse across it and get that energy from oxidative phosphorylation, which is an aerobic process requiring oxygen. All right, so first we trigger those oxidative fibers, and specifically the slow ones. Right, so our opposite fibers here were the slow oxidative, which we see first here, and then the fast glycolytic, which we see third here. Okay, so slow oxidative fibers come first. Our middle ground is still oxidative, but now we've got fast oxidative, right? So those ones that are intermediate in size and intermediate in their properties are also going to be in these sort of middle-sized motor units. So fast oxidative fibers go next. Okay. And then finally, we're going to use our strongest, biggest motor units, which have the strongest, biggest fibers. And they can be so big because they're just using glycolysis. They don't need to have mitochondria. They don't need oxygen. So finally, we have our fast glycolytic fibers being recruited. So in response to exercise, you're going to start from small to big. And this means that you are starting with your oxidative fibers, first the slow ones, then the fast ones. And then once you're doing really heavy exercise, you're recruiting those strong, fast glycolytic fibers. Okay. So this means that we have some things going on with fatigue when we think about different types of exercises, right? So if you want to exercise for a long time, you're going to want kind of efficient use of glucose to produce ATP. But if you want to do something really high intensity, requiring lots of strength, lots of speed, you're going to want to use your really strong contractile fibers. So high intensity exercises are using those glycolytic fibers, so our fast glycolytic fibers, right? So they have this less efficient form of energy production, which is going to lead to some fatigue. We also have the buildup of lactate, right? So in order to keep doing glycolysis, right, we need glucose. We're turning it into pyruvate. In that process, we took our electron carrier NAD+, tacked on a hydrogen to make it NADH. We need to get that initial condition back so that we can keep doing glycolysis. We're not worried about electron carriers for pulling them into the mitochondria now and creating that gradient, but we are still producing them because glycolysis is glycolysis. So we take pyruvate and turn it into lactate to get that NAD+ back. This creates a buildup of lactate. So like lactic acid is often at least blamed for some of that burning feeling that you feel when you're working really hard. So related to that glycolysis. While you're doing high intensity exercise, you're doing strong contractions with these glycolytic fibers. If you think about your body, right, like the muscle bunches up, there's only so much space in like your arm or your leg. So if it's starting to ball up, that means it starts to press on the blood vessels like next to it, and especially the blood vessels within the muscle. So these strong contractions actually compress blood vessels, which means you're getting even less blood flow to that muscle under these conditions, right? So really, we're limiting our oxygen to the muscle at the point that we're using these glycolytic fibers. Another way that we are getting fatigue sometimes when we do high intensity exercise is we're kind of like using up our acetylcholine in order to get a glycolytic fiber to like really contract, right? It's wide in diameter. Acetylcholine is our neurotransmitter that causes our muscle fibers to contract because it binds to the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, creates that action potential running down the sarcolemma into the T-tubule, which touches the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium, allowing our cross-bridge cycle to begin as it binds to troponin, pushing tropomyosin off the myosin binding sites on the actin, blah, 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 right? That takes acetylcholine because they're big. Kind of takes sometimes more acetylcholine to get them to fully contract to get enough calcium. So we can end up with neuromuscular fatigue as we're using that acetylcholine, as we're using up that neurotransmitter before producing more when we take the choline part. We also see alterations to enzyme activity here in high intensity exercise. And in general, our recovery from these exercises take like minutes to hours. Okay. For our low intensity exercises, we have kind of depletion of energy reserves. So that like would be the glucose in your body, but also the glycogen. This is going to take a longer time to recover because we're not just recovering from like we compress the blood vessels and we don't have oxygen and we need to like get more acetylcholine there. Now we're like really reacting to the fact that like you don't have the bonds to break in glycogen or glucose, right? So you need to eat more, you need to absorb that stuff, you need to get it into the cells. So this is going to take a longer time to recover, even though low intensity exercise in the moment is low intensity. It's just the process that is causing that depletion is different, right? You're using stuff up. Yeah. Now, other factors that influence resistance to fatigue are sometimes just mental as well, right? Your psychology does make a difference. What you're willing to push through, your will to win does have an influence on how fast you get tired too. It's not just cells, it's both and. So here we are looking at kind of how fatigue happens, right? So we can see here, right, that we have stimuli in the form of our pink arrows producing tension. So here we see isometric tension listed. So we're getting some tension, some contraction, some force in response to each of these stimuli. Right, at a certain point, as this continues on, right, we're going to see that we get less and less tension for each of our stimuli, right? So we're depleted some of those stores of energy. Maybe we've cut off oxygen, right? So we're causing fatigue here, right? So overall, once it's really, really fast altogether, what this might look like is we might see our tension rising quickly, right? So we know we have this kind of summation of basically calcium and therefore adding more and more muscle force, more tension as we have rapid stimuli in order. We reach a maximum amount of tension where these contraction phases kind of fuse. This is tetanus. And then we'd see that fatigue over time. If we then rest, right, depending how long we rest, how much we've recovered, the next time we try to elicit muscle contractions, right, that fatigue is going to happen potentially more rapidly, right? We have fewer energy stores available to us. The muscle is kind of tired, right? So you may have seen curves like this in physiology lab when you were doing muscle stuff on yourselves. Now, your muscles do respond to exercise. So when you train, it does have an effect. It kind of depends on the type of training you are doing, right? So basically, your body is going to try to make it so that you have the right type of muscle fibers available. There's only so much you can do, but one neat trick, right? You can't convert slow oxidative to fast glycolytic, but our two types of muscle fiber that start with fast, right? That fast is about the myosin type, essentially. And you kind of got the myosin type you got in a muscle fiber. But what you can do is express genes that produce enzymes or help you make numbers of mitochondria. So when you exercise, you can convert fast glycolytic fibers, some of them, into fast oxidative, and vice versa. So you can take some fast oxidative fibers and turn them into fast glycolytic fibers. Right? So this would involve like changing the number of mitochondria, changing the number of glycolytic enzymes, stuff like that. Okay, so that is a possibility. Okay, so depending on the form of exercise you're doing as you're training, right? If you're doing aerobic exercise, there's that word aerobic again, right? So aerobic means you need oxygen, right? That's the definition of aerobic, actually. Right, so during aerobic exercise, breathing heavily because you're sucking in that oxygen because you're doing an exercise that requires oxidative phosphorylation. So that oxidative capacity, that oxygen process is increasing. So if you're doing a lot of aerobic exercises, you'd expect to see the conversion of some fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers, all going with this oxygen stuff. So you'd see increases in the size and number of mitochondria. You'd see, keeping with the oxygen, right? You want that oxygen to diffuse across. So you're going to decrease the fiber diameter actually a little bit, make it a little thinner, so that you can get oxygen efficiently into those mitochondria that you've produced. And we can even change the blood flow. So we can increase the number of capillaries surrounding the muscle fibers, again, so we can efficiently get oxygen to those muscle fibers. Now, this is different than if you are training for something like sprinting or lifting, right? So that's going to be all about strength, right? You want strong, fast, but just short bursts, right? So your goal is to have fibers that can contract more strongly. So we're going to increase our fiber diameter. That means we're going to have a bunch of kind of byproduct effects of trying to get that fiber diameter to be so wide to produce that additional strength, right? When our fiber diameter is wide, this means we can't have oxygen diffuse across that cell as easily. So what we are doing is switching over to doing lots of glycolysis, right? Because glycolysis doesn't need oxygen, okay? So some of those fast oxidative fibers are turning into fast glycolytic fibers. So they're switching their form of metabolism, okay? Which means we're decreasing our oxidative capacity because we're not getting to oxidative phosphorylation, because this whole process is making it harder for our cells to get oxygen. It's even compressing blood vessels when we contract that strongly. So no point in having lots of oxidative capacity, which means we're also going to decrease our mitochondria because those are for oxidative phosphorylation. That's what they do. So you don't need them if you're just doing glycolysis. Our other byproduct here is that we are less resistant to fatigue because glycolysis is less efficient and those glycolytic fibers fatigue faster. Okay. So this is why you see kind of different effects sometimes depending on what type of exercise you are especially training for. Okay. The other way we see long-term muscle response to exercise is really a response to not using your muscle fibers. So muscle fibers do atrophy when you don't use them, right? You use it or lose it. So when we see lack of exercise, we see a decrease in the size of our muscle fibers as they lose myofibrils. And this can also be, rather than just you are sitting around, maybe recovering from a surgery or something, right? Like real disuse. This is also true in disease states, and things like muscular dystrophy also kind of causes this. Okay. So we do have two other types of muscle. So we're moving from skeletal muscle, which was specifically the domain of our somatic branch of the nervous system, right? Somatic nerves releasing acetylcholine connected to our voluntary type of muscle, our skeletal muscle. And we also have smooth and cardiac muscle. So we're really not going to talk about smooth muscle until A&P 2. So I'm just going to point out a few things here that are different for us right now so that we can get to the heart stuff, because I do want you to know how the heart works by the end of like next week, right? Okay, so what I want you to notice here for smooth muscle for us is that smooth muscle is involuntary, okay? And we saw that smooth muscle was one of our effector organs for the autonomic nervous system, right? So this means parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves are how we're innervating smooth muscle, okay? Other thing that is true, so we talked lots and lots about sarcomeres as we were talking about muscle contraction. Smooth muscle does contract, but smooth muscle is found like lining cavities. So like smooth muscle is in the walls of your blood vessel. So it doesn't want to contract in that same way. We're not always just like kind of trying to get shorter. So it doesn't really have sarcomeres. It has more of a kind of webbing structure. So it still contracts, it still has actin and myosin. It's just that contraction looks different. And that's kind of the depth to which we're going to go on. Yeah. The other thing we might notice in this picture, right, is that in our smooth muscle, we've got a nerve here just kind of sitting over a bunch of smooth muscle. So instead of going fiber to fiber for our smooth muscle, right, we're releasing neurotransmitters kind of at the top of like a bed of smooth muscle. And then all the smooth muscle cells are like connected to each other with gap junctions. So cytoplasm to cytoplasm. Okay. So that's what we're going to say about smooth muscle for now. Here you can see some pictures of that contraction. Okay. We are going to skip this part of the smooth muscle, but this contraction is slower in smooth muscle. Okay. Autonomic nervous system means sympathetic or parasympathetic, as I said before. And neurotransmitter is from varicosities. That's where we're leaving that. So we're just picking these two pieces to know for now about smooth muscle. So we'll come back to that smooth muscle and how it's triggered and how it operates when we talk about the blood vessels. We're going to skip the difference between single and multi-unit smooth muscle for now. Okay. What we want to talk about is the heart. So we are now moving essentially into cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is the muscle in your heart. So this is your heart organ itself. It's made of muscle. It's responsible for pumping blood out to your body. So it's really important for getting oxygen around, getting glucose around, getting all your nutrients. Vital to your function, right? If you have a heart attack and you don't get the heart restarted, you die, okay? So when we're thinking about the cardiovascular system, we are going to be splitting it up in this class, but cardio is the heart part. Vascular is all of our blood vessels is where that vascular is coming from. Then we also think about the blood, right? So the blood is in the heart, in the cardio part, and in the blood vessels, so in that vascular part. So that blood is transporting oxygen and nutrients. It's also taking our waste products from the cells where those waste products are being produced to the cells that eliminate those waste products, like the liver and the kidneys. It's also transporting things like hormones around your body so that we can get to different organs, moving immune cells around. It's moving clotting proteins to places where you've got cuts and you need to block blood vessels so you don't bleed out. So it's doing lots of important things for you. Okay. So we are going to start with understanding the heart itself so that we can talk about how the heart contracts, how that interacts with your blood pressure. How does that actually push blood around your body? And when we talk about the vasculature next semester, we'll be talking about some of those other components in more detail. We'll be talking about gas exchange as we move into the lungs as well. We'll be linking all those pieces together. Okay, so I've put up an assignment for you on basic anatomy of the heart. So half the points on that assignment, I should tell you, half of them are basically for the assignment itself. And then there's a long question that has you tracing all the blood flow through. Possibly I even picked this image and just put numbers on it. That one's extra credit, but please do it because we will be talking extensively about this. But so if you're worried about your exam score, basically there are 4.5 points of extra credit embedded in this assignment that I'm going to ask you to do for Wednesday. You have unlimited attempts on that. I want you to really know what we're looking at when we're thinking about the heart, so that when I tell you what electrical activity is in which chamber of the heart and how does that change the pressure so that we pump blood, you're not stuck on, okay, where are we? Okay. So just fundamentally running through right here in this picture. You'll go through this yourselves as well, but we have a 4-chambered heart. We have deoxygenated blood, so where we've used up the oxygen, coming in to our first chamber of the heart, the right atrium. Okay, so this is coming from the superior and inferior vena cava are the names of our veins coming into that right atrium, coming into this first part of the heart. Okay. Your right atrium is connected to a ventricle. So in sum total, we're going to see 2 atria at the top of the heart and 2 ventricles at the bottom of the heart. So blood is going to flow from that right atrium, okay, through a valve called your right atrioventricular or tricuspid valve into this right ventricle. So we go right, right, and then we're going to go left, left in the same order. Okay, so once we're in this right ventricle, okay, we're going to see this is all still deoxygenated blood. So now we want to get oxygen. So from our right ventricle, we're going to head out to the lungs. Okay. So here we see we're passing through another valve. This is a pulmonary. Anytime you see pulm, think lungs. So pulmonary semilunar valve, that has to do with the shape. Okay. So we're going to the lungs here, right? Because all this right side of the heart contain deoxygenated blood. So we're going out to the lungs where we pick up oxygen. You'll note this is the only time you will see an artery colored blue, right? So this was a pulmonary artery. We have both right and left coming out, right? Going to both of your lungs. It's blue because we still haven't picked up the oxygen. An artery is defined as a blood vessel leaving your heart. So when you see the word artery, it's about the direction of blood flow rather than about what exactly is in that tube. All right, so we go out to a lung over here where these labels are, right? So we got lungs kind of on either side over here. So we went out to a lung. Now we're coming back to the heart. So when we come back, we are going to be coming into the left atrium from the lungs. Okay. So we are going to have veins, which are now going to be our only veins colored red because they've just been to the lungs. They picked up their oxygen. So we have these pulmonary veins coming into the left atrium. Okay. From the left atrium, we go down into the ventricle. So we pass another valve, a left atrioventricular valve, into the left ventricle. Okay. And then from the left ventricle needs to be really strong because your left ventricle is what pushes blood out to the entire rest of your body. So from the left ventricle, we go into the aorta to basically everywhere. So this is how we're getting oxygenated blood in that aorta out to the rest of the body. And it also has a valve. Basically, all of these chambers of the heart and these blood vessels leaving the heart have valves so that we can control the direction of this blood flow. Okay, so we will stop there for today. Go ahead and practice this, look at this picture, make some sense of it before I see you next time, so that when we start talking about how these things are contracting, how the pressures work, we got our basis.